Working with local institutions, your historical society or archives in your town, or the library, even the public library, I think it's important to start conversations before there's some kind of disaster.
From the Society of American Archivists student chapter at the University of Alabama, this is Archives and Communities, a podcast highlighting community archiving initiatives and the people behind them.
I'm Sandy Yang, a student in the Archival Studies Social Justice Master's Scholarship Program at the University of Alabama's School of Library and Information Studies. Today, I'm excited to be speaking with Anna Kijas, an information professional. She is widely recognized for her innovative work at the intersection of music, librarianship, digital humanities, and cultural heritage preservation. She is currently head of Tufts Lilly Music Library. She has spent her career advancing open access publishing and helping evolve library services for the 21st century. Most recently, in 2022, she rapidly founded SUCHO, or Saving Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Online. Over 1,300 volunteers worldwide joined her in protecting at-risk heritage from the ongoing war. With cultural artifacts under dire threat today, I'd like to explore the creation of SUCHO. Anna, what compelled you to launch this incredible project?
Great. Thank you, Sandy. Going back to the early days of the project in 2022, the invasion, when it began on February 24th, everyone was watching, including myself, and just hoping that it would not last longer than a few days or a week. But of course, inevitably, we all realized and recognized that it was going to take longer than that. Being a music librarian and also somebody who is really passionate about cultural heritage, I started to think about what could be done to protect at least the heritage that has been digitized or that has a web presence. And so I reached out to a few friends in my community of librarians as well as digital humanities professionals and started asking if anyone was working on data preservation or digital preservation of the content that is on Ukrainian websites. And I kept hearing that there wasn't really anyone who was aware of anything happening at that time. And so my initial idea was to run a workshop. And so I thought, well, there was a conference that was happening that same week for the Music Library Association. And I have led a number of different digital humanities workshops and web archiving workshops in the past. And so I put out a call to see if anyone was interested in participating in a workshop where we would go through resources as well as walk through steps of, okay, how do you do web archiving, and focus on initially collections that were relevant to the music world, field of musicology, ethnomusicology, sound recordings, and so forth. Within the first few days, I started getting hundreds and then up to 1,000 people who signed up for the workshop. And so it was really a little overwhelming. And I was like, wow, there's an enormous interest of people who want to help in some way. And so at that point, I also started seeing calls on social media from other folks asking how they could help or what could be done to web archive content from Ukraine. And at that point, that's when I connected with one of my co-founders, Sebastian Majsterowicz, who was at the time in Vienna, and my other colleague and co-founder, Quinn Dombrowski, who I've known through my work in digital humanities. The three of us connected, and within a few days, we decided that we needed to do something much larger beyond a simple workshop that would focus on web archiving. And so we basically started forming the initial ideas for SUCHO. And by March 1st, we had a website up. We put up a new Google form and had circulated it on our networks and social media and so forth, and had over 1,000 volunteers by the end of the first week sign up. And from there, we just started working on identifying different ways to help safeguard some of this digital cultural heritage. And the largest, I think, contribution was the web archiving. Before Twitter became X, and before all of that kind of messiness started to happen with the transition of ownership of Twitter, many folks who are in that world of digital humanities and libraries as well are on social media. And so that was the fastest and simplest way to get the word out. That's where it really started, just promoting what we were trying to do. And then sending emails out on listservs. So, our different networks in digital humanities, in music librarianship, and I'm sure there were other listservs that people were spreading the word on as well. I think it went out on a couple of different archives listservs and regional networks as well. So really just getting the word out that way was, I think, really impactful.
What criteria or strategies did SUCHO use to prioritize which cultural sites to archive first, given the enormity of the task?
This was a bit challenging. We had a number of different approaches to doing this work and to identifying and prioritizing cultural sites. So one of the tools we used was asking volunteers in SUCHO, as well as people who were interested in helping by suggesting cultural sites that should be archived. So again, internally, we used Slack for communication with everyone in the group. And then we also had a Google form where people could submit links to cultural sites that had website or digital content and tell us, a little bit about what this was. And then we would review it and identify whether or not it was something we wanted to prioritize. We took I would say like a broad brushstroke in terms of what we considered cultural heritage. So if you, look at what UNESCO might consider cultural heritage, or some of the other organizations, worldwide organizations, Blue Shield and so forth, we were really interested in all types of cultural heritage that could be represented either by physical objects, by intangible content such as, people singing, people speaking, oral histories, that kind of thing, as well as, monuments that maybe had photographs or 3D models, or even walking tours, things like of that nature. We tried to build our own kind of inventory of what cultural sites we wanted to archive. And the volunteers, as well as people who were submitting these links via Google Forms, were, really helpful in this effort. We also, of course, did the kind of usual review of resources online in Wikipedia, in Wikidata, as well as looking at resources like encyclopedias, right? LibGuides, and try to pull together a list of all the museums in Ukraine or all the libraries and so forth. And that was helpful to an extent. But then once we got to some of the smaller organizations and institutions like rural museums or small historical societies, there was a lot of gaps, right? And there was a lot of missing information that we didn't have documented in some of those resources that we were checking. And at that point, it really came down to our volunteers using tools like Google Maps or OpenStreetMaps, and literally walking digitally through those maps to identify additional organizations that we may have missed. And so that was one of the ways in which we were able to identify things like, regional museums, or even public libraries or school libraries, after-school programs, churches, religious institutions, and so forth. And then also we were able to get a listing of all of the domains, the web domains in Ukraine, and work through those lists to identify, okay, which of these domains are tied to cultural heritage organizations. So really multi-pronged approach, not perfect in any way, but at that point in time when we were trying to sort of rush against the clock, just all hands on deck and looking at any resources we could get access to was really the main approach. And finally, I'll say that we had great help from one of our colleagues and volunteers, Erica Peasley, who started working with us from the very beginning. She's an information security professional. And so her knowledge and expertise of how information security works and looking at sites that might be under threat physically, what sites are being targeted by the military, as well as, physically, but also looking at the network and the internet and looking at what is being taken down. So that aspect and perspective that she had from information security was applied to this work as well, because we were able to see, if a certain region was being attacked, for example, when Kharkiv was being attacked or Donetsk, we could identify any institutions in that area and try to prioritize saving that content before moving on to something else, especially if servers were hosted or that content was hosted in that same region, because of course there's always a threat, even if it's digitized, if servers are attacked and destroyed, right, that content could potentially be lost forever.
That multi-pronged approach makes a lot of sense. In activating such a wide team using everybody's strengths and being very strategic about it. In response to real-time threats, what advice would you give to others looking to start similar projects?
I think, for folks who want to start similar cultural heritage preservation projects in their communities, working with local institutions, whether it's, your historical society or archives in your town, or the library, even the public library, I think it's important to start conversations before there's some kind of disaster or, threat. Of course, sometimes it's not possible to predict these things, but thinking about how do you safeguard and how do you preserve cultural heritage is something that needs to happen as part of long-term planning and not just, when it's under duress. And so I think that there are so many amazing societies, the Society for American Archivists, the various library associations like IFLA, for example, that have professionals who are already thinking and have been thinking and working on preserving cultural heritage for a long time. And so I think that it's a conversation that needs to happen, especially around digital preservation as well and digital safeguarding, because when they see damage that has happened to physical artifacts, there are already established methods and approaches for how do you remedy those things? How do you do conservation work? How do you do emergency planning, disaster planning for physical artifacts? But I think that when it comes to the digital side, people sometimes think, okay, well, it's backed up. It's either in the cloud or it's on a server or a hard drive. Don't have to really think about it maybe the same way as we do about the physical content that is in an archive or a museum. But I think that has been demonstrated, right, clearly with this invasion of Ukraine, that is not the case. Not every institution, especially institutions abroad, may not have the same level of resources, right? Financial resources, infrastructure, even just knowledge and expertise and staff. So I think that it's a conversation that should be happening early on, and people need to be thinking about, well, is that content that we've digitized and put all that effort and time into cataloging and creating metadata and curating, is that going to be safe if something happens? Where are our servers located, right? Are they in the same building as our, museum or institution, or is it on the other side of the world, and what's happening over there? So those are things that I think this work that we've been doing with Ukraine has really brought to the foreground here. There's a web archive at the University of North Texas that has done kind of the transition of presidential administrations. And I know other people and institutions have also been web archiving that content, like government content, right? And so thinking about not just preserving cultural heritage because it's important and we need to think about how to keep it safe for the long term, but also the content on these websites can be changed, and it could be propaganda, it could be censorship. And so thinking about using web archiving as a way to preserve that content so that, whether it's a historian who's doing research years from now and wants to go back and see how that content changed and what the message was at that point in time, or, a student or just the general public who wants to compare and see it. I think that's really important to think about too.
What misconceptions about digital archiving did this crisis reveal? What does our field need to overcome?
Yeah, I think that the fact that content that is online, so, whether it's a website, whether it's digitized files, it is still being hosted. It is still dependent on physical infrastructure. And I think that in our field, and so, I'm a librarian by training, not a trained archivist, so I can't speak as an archivist, but I will say that from what I've read and from my interaction with people in the field of archives and libraries as well, we are aware, right, that this content is hosted somewhere and that there needs to be redundancy, right? There needs to be a repository that we, are certain that has some kind of either preservation layer or that someone is maintaining and making sure that the files are not deteriorating, et cetera. So I think in the field, it's established, and I think people know that. But I think when it comes to everyday work, we may not necessarily be as aware of, okay, well, the institutions, such as in Ukraine, which of those institutions have their files backed up and not just on someone's hard drive or a local server? I think that kind of information is not easily accessible. It's known to the people who are working in those institutions, perhaps, but when there's a crisis or when there's a disaster or war that has occurred, people are not necessarily thinking about preserving the digital content first, right? They're thinking about how can we move these objects out of this building before it gets hit by a missile or before, water comes in and floods everything. So I think that it's really just raising awareness. And that's something that with SUCHO we've been doing, and when we've been talking with media. And so one of the earlier interviews that I did with Quinn Dombrowski was with PBS NewsHour, and we were talking about the physicality of content that is digital, that is, websites or digitized content, and the fact that it is wires and equipment, and it's not just in the cloud magically being backed up. That was something that people were like, oh, I didn't think about that. I didn't realize that this was not something that just, would be safe because it's not physically sitting there. And so I think that raising that awareness is really important in our field, but also just to the general public about, thinking about their own content that they might be creating or curating. People have their own family archives. Who's actually maintaining that content? Where is it hosted? So I think that's really the main thing. And I guess the other, I don't know if necessarily if it's a misconception, I think it's just maybe just something to think about is, we are, of course, at our own institutions, invested in working with our own collections and making sure that they are preserved for the long term, and that they can be, accessed and that hopefully we have disaster plans in place and so forth. But I think that it's also worth considering how can we collaborate regularly with other institutions that may not have that same level of access to resources. And so with the example of Ukraine, that is something that we've been doing with SUCHO, is that we have built relationships with organizations that have cultural heritage materials of all sizes and, all kinds, from public to private, government funded, et cetera. And how can we build relationships maybe between our own institution and even a single institution in another country, and try to have some kind of either mentorship program or just a conversation about how do you do digital preservation of the types of things that are in your collection. So I think it's, sort of thinking globally is really important, because especially with digital content where often we have collections that have additional items located in other institutions around the globe, right? So, we may have a collection of particular letters or correspondence from an individual, but there may be other institutions around the globe that have bits and pieces as well. And so I think it's worth, having and building those relationships.
And so could you envision the creation of a global rapid response archive preservation team, which would mobilize volunteer experts?
Yes, I think that we have already had people reach out to us, as well as we've seen just people starting similar initiatives. And so one of the things that we have done from the very beginning is made all of our resources available openly, right? So that means all of our tutorials, our workflows, how we're approaching different levels of web archiving and preserving digital content, so that if people want to use that as a model, they can. We are thinking and working on creating a more formal toolkit that we will be putting out. That's something that is still in progress. I think that, again, going back to some of the earlier questions, it's really, I think, important that in our fields, but also just generally, that people have an awareness about making sure that there is a plan for physical as well as digital preservation, especially in emergency situations. And I think that while SUCHO turned into this really enormous project and initiative, and it's still going on. We've shifted through different phases, but we're still working on making sure that the content is safeguarded and so forth. I think that the best approach is to be prepared, which again is not always possible, but at least having some kind of a plan, having access to either resources locally or globally. It could be through those relationships between archives and libraries with other institutions. I think that's a more realistic approach than spinning up a rapid response team every time something happens. It's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of volunteer labor, at least with the way that we did it with SUCHO. And that is really, it's great that people came together and that we were able to help in this enormous way. But I think that it's challenging to sustain, right? It's not a long-term sustainable solution. If there's a way to potentially partner with other organizations, which we've been in communication and had conversations with UNESCO and other organizations, the National Library, the Ukrainian Library Association, for example, and other organizations about ways that we could support their work and bringing attention again to the digital side, right? Because so much of the attention has been on the physical. I think that is what I would love to see, is to be able to have those types of partnerships and to have maybe a team that is more focused on the digital content as part of whether it's UNESCO or IFLA or ICOM or one of those organizations. They are already doing some of that work. I don't know, the extent of how much they have thought about doing a kind of a rapid response, but I think that it's much more sustainable when you have partnerships and collaborations with these organizations. Otherwise, it's on the shoulders of volunteers to do this kind of work every time there's a need, which can be done. But I think that the way that we approached it with SUCHO in this, enormous way with so many volunteers is something that is not sustainable for a very long time.
I think those are great lessons. What sustainability precautions is SUCHO taking to preserve digital assets over the long term?
Yeah. That's a great question. In 2022, when we were focused on web archiving as much of the cultural heritage content as possible, we were web archiving using a few different approaches. So we used the Wayback Machine with Internet Archive. And so we were in, regular kind of conversation with the Internet Archive folks to make sure that they were okay with us sending all this content there, and that, if we had any questions or needed help with anything, they were able to assist us. So, of course, the Internet Archive has its own servers, and they have their own processes for how they look at long-term sustainability of digital content. And so that was sort of an easy way for us to push content there, because we know that they can be trusted, right? They have already been preserving that kind of web content for over 20, 25 years at this point, maybe longer. We keep getting older, and I forget how what year it is now. So they're one of our partners. We also were working on creating. We were storing still are storing content in WAXI files, which is a format that allows you to basically compartmentalize or put all of the content from a website into a nice little container, right? And then you can replay it with tools like there's a replay application. And so that was done with Browser Tricks, which is a software package that Ilya Kramer developed. And actually, Internet Archive is now also outputting things as WAXI files when you send content to be web archived. So that's a nice way to containerize it, and then to be able to, hand it to someone if they need it back. We were not and are not going to be digital stewards of this content forever. That was not the goal. The goal was to safeguard this content. And so, whether it's putting it into the Internet Archive or creating waxy files or storing it on our servers, we can then return that content to those institutions if they've lost content and they want it back. That's has been our goal. And that has been the conversation we've had with institutions. In terms of some other related projects with kind of stewarding and preserving digital assets, we started a project called Memory Savers over the summer. And that was a project where we were working with institutions in Ukraine who partnered with a student intern, to actually digitize their own content. And so they were training the students. So the museum professionals were working together with the students, and the students were working on projects that needed to be prioritized and digitized. And so that was our way of putting together a program where we could create those relationships and, or at least start them, facilitate that relationship. The relationships were really created and maintained by those interns and the museum professionals, but they are now taking charge of their own digital assets, right? And so they're storing them, they're putting them in different repositories, they're putting them in a platform called Museum Digital, which is a platform that allows you to curate your museum digital collections. And they are now, doing that work. So they can make decisions about, okay, what is important for us to digitize? Where do we want to store it, and so forth. So that was sort of our approach to putting it back in those, institutions' hands and letting them have the control over their own content, because they are the experts and they know what is important to their institution and their communities and so forth.
What's next for SUCHO? What are your goals for the next phase as the work continues?
I have a number of different goals. One goal that we've been working on since we've web archived all of the content is to go through all of that content, which we've been doing slowly, and create some basic metadata. So we're basically creating like authority records and resource records, which identify the institution, the collection, and any of the objects that we've web archived, so that we can easily then have an inventory that institutions can look at and see, okay, did we save their content? So that's sort of a public inventory that we're working towards creating. Andreas Stegerberg and Sebastian Meisterovich created a database that we're using internally for that work. And then we have a number of volunteers who have been working on cleaning that metadata. That's in progress. And we're hoping that sometime this year we'll be able to push that out and then share it back to the institutions so that they can see what's in that inventory. Other projects that we're working on. So I mentioned Memory Savers. Memory Savers started this summer, and it was meant to be kind of a 6-month project or internship period for 22 museums that would take on an intern and, as I said earlier, allow them to, gain some skills, contribute towards projects that were underway, learn how to digitize and work with a variety of artifacts. So that kind of training and building on practical skills in museum work was really the goal of this program. That is a project that has ended. It ended in December, and we are now getting reports back out from the students and the institutions of all of the amazing work. And so that's something that we will be sharing out. There's a Facebook page for Memory Savers that I can share a link with you. So if you or listeners are interested in taking a look, you can definitely go there. But we're hoping to have a report or some kind of output that we can share that identifies all of the projects that people have worked on. The Memory Savers project, we're looking at how to extend that beyond this first phase. We have some ideas, but we haven't finalized anything just yet. So definitely working on continuing some kind of training program, whether it will be, again, a full-on Memory Savers kind of standalone project with institutions, or whether it will be a smaller version where we're collaborating with maybe a single institution or just a handful of institutions. That's still something we're waiting to see. And then finally, we are also working on putting together a mentorship program. So slightly different than Memory Savers. The mentorship program would really be a way to create a network between mentors slash experts who may be in archives, museums, libraries, some other kind of digital, humanities or preservation work anywhere around the globe who might be able to provide expertise and mentorship to someone in Ukraine who has a specific need. So maybe it's someone who is working on digitizing film or, creating a collection of curated objects from their institution and needs some guidance with metadata or whatever it is. So that is something we've been talking with the Center for Urban History in Lviv, and they are interested in potentially collaborating with us on that effort and working with other institutions and just putting people together. And so it would be a way for SUCHO to, again, facilitate this network, bring in experts that we've, met and have participated maybe in SUCHO, but also opening it up to other people who have that kind of expertise and capacity and willingness to help without taking on another huge project like SUCHO itself. It would be just a way to build those relationships and provide expertise.
That's really powerful stuff. How can people get involved?
What we've learned from SUCHO is volunteers with various backgrounds and all levels of technical expertise were able to contribute. And so this is something that, I think anyone who is excited about helping and not just watching, what's going on the news, but wants to jump in and do some kind of work. There are other efforts. So in addition to SUCHO, there are efforts that one of our colleagues, San Jose State University, Yulia Gosart, has been leading to help with regional Ukrainian libraries to help buy books, to help buy equipment. So I can send a link to that as well for, if people are interested in just simply donating some kind of money, or I think they may also be taking physical items. I'm not sure about that. We can check the website. But I think with SUCHO, when we put out a call about the mentorship / knowledge network, if there are people who are willing to contribute their expertise and time to someone who's in Ukraine, that is another way that they can get involved. And also if you have the time and may or may not have a lot of technical expertise, doing something as simple as going to the Wayback Machine in the Internet Archive and just backing up, just web archiving content that you think is important. Those are just some ways that anyone can really get involved. If you have an idea, feel free to reach out. There's on the SUCHO website, you can reach out to either all of us, Quinn, myself, and Sebastian, or to one of us individually. It's fine. We're always willing to talk and to hear people's ideas. And that's really how we've built partnerships and collaborations with other people and institutions. People will just reach out and say, hey, I have this great idea, or, there's a grant. Can we maybe partner on this together? There are various ways that people can help.
That's beautiful. To wrap up, what gives you the greatest hope for our field and everything you do? What keeps you going?
Through SUCHO and this enormous group of volunteers, it really demonstrated people's willingness to contribute and help, even without necessarily knowing much about Ukraine or knowing, some people did not know anyone in Ukraine or couldn't even, read in Ukrainian, for example. I think it's just kind of the humanity of people, like just willing to help was amazing. But really what I think is giving me hope for people are going to be contributing to help preserve this cultural heritage going forward. Really with the Memory Savers program, I think it was amazing watching the students working as interns with these institutions, the time and effort that they were putting in and the skills and expertise that they were gaining. is really exciting because I think it shows that there are aspiring and emerging museum professionals who are going to continue this work, right? They're working with physical artifacts, but they're already being introduced to how do you digitize them? How do you create metadata? How do you think about preserving them long term? And I think that that's the important part of it, is just having people who are excited about doing this work and giving them a chance to gain that expertise and knowledge. And I think that that's what will hopefully help people in Ukraine persevere, is to see that, especially the younger folks are really excited and interested about, making sure that their history and memory is preserved and are doing something about it. And so I think that that's one of the things that really, really gives me a lot of hope.
It's planting the seeds and inspiring other information workers to support this effort. What's the best way for people to reach you?
I mean, you can reach, if you want to use the general email for myself, Quinn, and Sebastian, it's info@sucho.org. You can also reach out to me personally. It's my university email is my first and last name, anna.kijas@topstudy.edu. So those are the main ways you can reach out. I'm on social media as well. So if you're on Twitter, Mastodon, or Blue Sky, you'll find me there.
Thank you again for speaking with me, Anna.
Yeah, thank you.
This was an episode of Archives and Communities, the official podcast of the SAA student chapter at the University of Alabama. Music by Scanglobe and Scott Holmes. Opinions expressed in this podcast are not reflective of any particular institution. Thank you for listening, and join us again next time.